This is an oral history interview with Herbert Kaiser in his office on December 22nd, 1982. The interviewer is Susan Gortner. Mr. Kaiser, where was your father born and what was his name?
Well, my father's name was Harry E. Kaiser. He was born on the corner of the public square here at Monticello. My grandfather's house was on the southeast corner of the square where the park is now. And this was a house that was built by Dr. Christopher Ward in 1852. Dr. Ward's grave is very apparent out at the cemetery north of town because it's right alongside one of the roadways. My grandfather didn't get here till 1854. He was married to one of the Sipple sisters, and two sisters and two brothers-in-law came overland by spring wagon from Little Sandusky, which is just a crossroads town near Upper Sandusky in Wyandotte County, Ohio. And they came out here in 1854, and for the first winter spent it in a log cabin, or bad accommodation anyway, just over the hill, which is supposed to be the highest point in Piatt County, north of White Heath. Then he came down, my grandfather did, to Monticello the next spring, I suppose, and bought the house there on the corner of the square, which was a white frame house with a white picket fence around it. And down where the church is, on what I think is Livingston Street, or is that Lafayette Street? I don't know.
Lafayette.
On Lafayette Street. That was the barn lot for the Kaiser family, and the Kaiser family sold that lot to the Catholic Church about 1905 or 6 along in there, so that they could build their church there. My grandfather was a very strong Union supporter and tried to enlist in the Union Army. At that time, Camp Butler down on the way to Springfield was the place that you would go to enlist. Later on, it became a Confederate prison camp, and it's full of Confederate soldiers' graves. They died there on account of an epidemic of some kind that just took them off. But he went down there trying to enlist, and they turned him down. He was 4F in the Civil War, and the reason was that he was flat-footed. And the reason I think that he was flat-footed was that he'd been on his feet all his life. He was our town's first grocer. And back in those days, in fact, it wasn't until the late 1860s that the shoemakers, or bootmakers, began making different shoes for the right and left feet. Before that time, they were both the same. And the way they tried to keep them from rubbing calluses on the feet was that the boots you wore on your right foot today, you wore on your left foot the following day. So you alternated them back and forth. And whether for that reason or some other, I don't know, but he was flat-footed, and they turned him down. They wouldn't let him enlist. And except for that, I wouldn't be here, probably, because he had to return to his family, and while the war was still on, in 1864, my own father came along. And my father, I better tell you about my grandfather. He was the town's first grocer. He lived over on one corner of the square, and his grocery store was on the west side of the square. Now, I don't know what he used to begin with as a grocery store, but the courthouse, the first courthouse, which is a frame building where the present courthouse is, that looked for all the world like a country schoolhouse, although my description of it as a country schoolhouse is dated. There aren't any such things today. but a small structure. When the county wanted to build the second courthouse to go on that site, my grandfather bought the first courthouse, moved it across the street on the west side of the street, and that was his grocery store. And he was in partnership with a number of several different people, I think, through his lifetime as a grocer until the middle 70s, when there was a disastrous fire that wiped out his store and several other frame buildings at the same time on the west side of the square. Well, he had insurance, but as it happened, it was fraudulent, or for some reason they didn't pay him off, and I'm sure that put a pretty distinct crimp in him financially. And I don't know when it was that he transferred his grocery store over to what had been his home on the southeast corner of the square. By that time, he had moved off of it, and he had bought the first Methodist church ever constructed in the town. It was at the northwest corner of the intersection of Market and Marion Streets. They moved up to their present location on Main Street and built their first brick church there. But my grandfather bought the old Methodist church for the lumber that was in it, and with it and other lumber constructed the family home there. That was a very good location back in those days. His neighbor to the north was Dr. Knott, probably the town's best-known doctor. This is on, Market Street is on the section line. You know, it goes straight through to Bement. And this was the route of the old stagecoach at the time when the stagecoach took people from Monticello to Bement, which had the railroad long before we had a railroad here. Well, I might tell you that my grandfather's name was John F. Kaiser, and he spelled it Kiser. And his wife, one of the Sipple sisters that came out in 1854, had a brother who was in the Civil War, and the story is told that he had to have a mount. So he and other officers, or maybe they weren't officers, I don't know, went out to select a mount from a number of them there, and there was one peculiarly colored horse that looked like a very good one to my grandmother's brother, and he decided to take that one. Nobody else wanted it, and he said that that horse could go with his regiment all day long and yet outrun any horse in the camp that night. And there was one occasion on which he was being pursued by the Confederates, that one of the early railroad's trestles, he urged his horse to take this high railroad trestle, and the horse did, and carried him across to safety, and his pursuers were afraid to attempt it. Well, this horse was brought to Monticello ultimately, and was the Kaiser family's family horse, kept in the barn down south of them on the lot, with the surrey and all the equipment. And this was the horse in our family when my father was a boy growing up. Well, at any rate, the grocery store finally got moved after my grandfather had moved off of the square, and Dr. Neuker, who'd lived right across the street, had moved off the square to get what was for in that day a remarkable brick home down in the southwest corner of Monticello, with a circular staircase which was difficult to build and unusual in those days, or this, winding up in it. Guy Burns owned it at one time. I don't know who's in there now. But when these people were moving off the square, it was getting too commercial. Then my grandfather's store was over in this building. And I can remember that building still being erected at the time that I was a boy of 6 or 7, probably. We were Presbyterians, and we would go to the Presbyterian church and get up on Main Street and head east to the family home, and we would go by it. And at that time, the grocer there, my grandfather having been dead some years now, the fellow running the grocery store there was a fellow by the name of Rodney Ball. And the amusing thing was Rodney Ball had a cat. And the floor of the windows representing the showcase in the front of the building were covered by hard candies. And that was a favorite place in the sun. We would see the cat sleeping on top of the hard candies on our way home from church. The home that we were going to was on East Main Street and the 300 block on the south side of the street. And this was a home that had been built by my father during the period of his engagement to my mother. That would have been in 1898 or 9. And there was nothing remarkable about the home in that day, but it's amusing to recall now that they debated whether or not to put this newfangled thing called electric lights in the home. And they ultimately decided to do it, but the early electric lights were not fixtures. There would be just a light cord hanging from the middle of the ceiling and a bare bulb at the end of that. And the idea of inside plumbing had been around since at least Roman times, but there were not very many people in Monticello yet, really, that had that. And the house was built without inside plumbing. My mother had a range, a cook stove, an old-fashioned cook stove, and while other people ordinarily would use coal to burn, wood was a much cleaner fuel, and there was lots of wood available out of the woods around here, and some old woodsite would come in, haul a cord of wood in, and stack it on the back end of the lot, and then it would be quite an enterprise. You'd get some man to saw it up in appropriate lengths for the stove, and then split these blocks. And then the next thing was to carry these things all prepared now for the stove into what was called the woodshed. Well, now, we were so nice that we had not an ordinary outdoor privy like so many others had, but we had our privy combined with the woodshed. So the customary description of what you were going to do was, I'm not going out to the privy, I'm going out to the woodshed in our family. And these privies endured in Monticello for a long, long time, and they were favorite objects on Halloween. To push over the various privies was quite a deal of sport in those times. They couldn't push ours over. It was too substantial. But there have been stories of people being inside when the pushing occurred. So
also pushed over with the door down. What was your mother's name, and where was she born?
My mother was born in a log cabin in the country outside Colfax, C-O-L-F-A-X, Indiana, which is an old Indiana town just a little way south of Lafayette, Indiana. My grandfather was born in what was then Virginia and later became West Virginia, but over fairly near to Washington. As a boy, he used to swim in the Potomac River. And his mother died when he was still just a baby. His father, in company with other men from their vicinity, started west About that time, there was an Indian uprising. Local people in the town thought that the whole group had been killed by the Indians because none of them ever returned. And so that's a probable supposition. I don't know where the West was back in those days when you started out from Virginia. But having been left an orphan, my grandfather was raised by a family by the name of Doyle. And finally, the Doyle families, his foster brother and two foster sisters, left Virginia on the general trek which all of America seemed to be making that time westward, and came to Colfax, Indiana. And there my grandfather Harlan, Harlan, met his wife, whose name was Sarah Weaver, and her father had been in the Revolutionary War, but they were coming east from Ohio as far as Indiana on the general trek west, and they met there and were married and had some children, including my mother, back in that place before they moved out here something over 100 years ago. By that time, my grandfather was able to come as far as Bement by train. And then he walked the rest of the way up to the Bethel neighborhood in the north part of Piatt County. You know Bethel Church, don't you? Mm-hmm. All right. It was that general neighborhood that he went because by that time, two of his foster sisters were living in that area. A man by the name of Isaiah Holloway came from Colfax with his wife Ann Doyle, my grandfather's foster sister, and her sister Lucinda, who lived with them. Mm-hmm. And they established their home on a farm in the Bethel neighborhood. Ultimately, Ann died, and then he married Lucinda. And they're all buried in the old cemetery at Farmer City, just south and west of the downtown district. But that was the reason that my grandfather finally followed them out here with his family. There was one girl of 18 who had already met her young man back in Colfax. And after a year out here, he came west to claim his bride, and then they went back to Colfax. So there's some part of the family on my mother's side that is still around Colfax before they jumped to Illinois. And then from that time, the Harlan children, my mother's brothers and sisters, spread out all the way west to Oregon, to California, to one settled in Iowa, and that was the way it went on the way to the Pacific coast back in those days. But they settled there in the Bethel neighborhood, although they didn't go to that church. At that time, there was a Presbyterian church in Mansfield, long since gone, and they went to this church. And when finally my grandfather retired from the farm, he moved into Monticello, and with my grandmother and my mother, and this is the way that we happen to be Presbyterians today because of that church back in Mansfield.
Now you say your grandfather came to Bement on the train?
To Bement on the train.
From Ohio?
No, from Indiana.
Well, Indiana.
From someplace near Colfax.
What year was that?
Oh, I'll have to guess on this. I'd say 1872, along in there. And I remember the story in our family that he could hear the coyotes or wild beasts of some kind hooting and all that on his walk from Bement up to I don't know, 20 miles, I suppose, or almost up to the Bethel neighborhood.
Did the train come? Did they have to go to Chicago first and then down? Is that?
I don't think so. I think that the main line of the Wabash, you see, the east-west line of what was then the Wabash, was the main line. And when they ran north from Bement to Chicago, that was called the Chicago branch. And I think that he got on this rail line that extended into Ohio to the east or someplace. When we would go back to visit my Aunt Kate on the farm back near Colfax when I was a boy, we would take the train to Crawfordsville, and we would change trains there to go to Colfax. And I can recall being there and being at loose ends, and anybody wanting to see the town. And that was the home of General Lew Wallace. I think that he was the author of Ben-Hur, wasn't he? And that home is kept there at Crawfordsville today as a sort of museum. Now I can look at my notes and still go on.
You were talking about your grandfather's general store earlier.
Well, grocery store.
Grocery store.
Yes.
How long now it was located where the park is today, across from the Dairy Queen?
I don't know. I don't know whether he moved there after the fire in the middle 70s. Mm-hmm. He died in 1899, and it may well be that was the next move. He owned the building anyway, you know. And I'm not dead sure when the family moved to the new home that he built out of Methodist Church lumber on Market Street.
Where was the grocery store? You talked about passing it on the way to church. Where was it located at that time?
Well, that was the family home at the southeast corner of the public square.
How long did the store remain in that location?
Well, not too long after that. I have a picture of the Catholic Church when it was just constructed, and the object was to take the church, but unavoidably they took the back end of this house, which is up the block. The trouble with the house was that the foundations were poor. It began to list. So finally my father took it down. And he loved theater. He loved going to shows. He put up a billboard on that location at the corner of the square. So whenever there was a lot of entertainment coming through back in those days, live entertainment, and they would always want his billboard to put up spreads advertising the shows. So we got tickets constantly to everything that would come here to what we called, without tittering, the Opera House, and to circuses and everything like that, principally in Decatur, but sometimes in Champaign. Well, I don't know, that persisted for a long time.
Do you recall going to programs at the Opera House?
Oh, my goodness gracious. I've been in shows at the Opera House.
What kind of shows were you in?
Well, you see, that was our theater back in those days. You didn't have auditoriums in school buildings and things like that. When I was in high school, there was an oratorical contest. One fellow would have, or one branch of it would be an essay, and various things, and one thing would be extemporaneous speaking. And I got the gold medal on one occasion on extemporaneous speaking, speaking from the stage of the Opera House to the group out in front. And later years, when I was more than grown and married and everything like that. I was an end man and a minstrel there. Now, do you know what an end man and a minstrel is?
No, I don't. Would you explain it?
Oh my! Well, you had everybody all blacked up to be Negroes, and you sat around in a circle on the stage, and the master of the ceremonies sat in the middle of the circle at the back of the stage. And it was a conversation. Well, you could run in musical numbers and everything like that. But this fella ran the show, and the people who had the speaking parts were the end men. They were the ones nearest to the audience on this semicircle, you see. And as I say, I was one of the end men in one of those things. And, you got all kinds of corny jokes on the local population and everything like that. I remember when I was you tried to imitate a Negro dialect. Did you know Gene Hudson, a lawyer here?
No.
All right. He's not been dead very long. Do you know Keith Hudson? Is his father. And Gene Hudson had just got dictaphone equipment in his office. I can't remember just how the joke went, but did you hear about this year, Mr. Hudson? He got that there dictaphone equipment in his office. Well, no, hadn't heard about that. And it was carried along, a little conversation back and forth. So, there's only one bad thing about it, says Mr. Hudson. It never crosses its legs. This would be the general type of the jokes. I remember I had to sing a song. I can't remember what it was now, with Jean on my lap. You know, he was supposed to be a young lady.
What type of professional entertainment came there?
Oh, you'd be surprised. We were on the midpoint of the Wabash between Chicago and St. Louis. And there were traveling companies from time to time who had a date in one or the other towns, and then a later date at the other, who had a day or two to spare in between. And we could snag those for our own opera house here. So we had some pretty good quality entertainment. I can recall on one occasion actually hearing grand opera in our opera house. I can tell you it was very poorly attended, but they were there on stage and singing grand opera just the same. And the opera house, as I say, that was where all the shows were giving, the oratorical contests. Everything that demanded a theater was there in the opera house. I remember when the first long movie I think ever produced, which was Birth of a Nation, was brought here. And, there was an orchestra in the pit. I played piano a little bit there. Burl Eady, Judge Eady, was a fellow who ran the orchestra. And he played cornet, and his brother Willis played drums, and I can't remember all the rest of it. But we'd never seen any movie before like The Birth of a Nation. And with this professional orchestra in the pit, this was long before the days of sound movies, and in the battle scenes, they burned powder, or they had some way of making you think you smelled the battle while a battle scene was going on. That was a great thrill, back in those days.
So that was shown at the Opera House, not the old theater, the Lyric Theater.
That was long before the Lyric Theater.
The Lyric Theater was
Yes. When the movies first came here, they were called Nickelodeons. It only cost you a nickel to get in. And I can remember when we'd have as many as 3 movies in Monticello. They were all silent pictures. I remember coming home from school. I attended the South School, coming up to the corner of the square and going around to look and see what was available at the various movies.
Will they show them at the Opera House and the Lyric Theater? Where else would they show them?
Well, this was long before the Lyric Theater.
Oh, it wasn't?
Oh, yes, long before that.
Where else? Where would they show them?
Well, there was a movie theater right next to what became the Lyric in the one-time brick building that preceded the present brick building there. And in the summertime, there being no air conditioning, they had some benches and so forth out where the Lyric Theater later was. It was a vacant lot at that time, and a screen up there, and the people sat out there on those benches and watched the movies. That was called the Air Dome or Airdrome, I don't know which. There was a movie on the north side of the square in a building which now has been encompassed by the National Bank of Monticello. There have been movies on both the north and south side of West Washington Street in the block immediately west of the square. Now, perhaps you don't know that block there, the block from Charter Street down to Market Street on Washington Street, that block down from the square, back in my boyhood days and long after that to old-timers, was known as the Levee. The reason for it was not a place of very good repute. There were saloons along there, too. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but if you walk up north on Charter Street on the west side of the square, you'll see that the building which now houses a Candlewick restaurant extends east. It's not on a line with the west side of the square. Now, if you were walking along Washington Street on the north side of the square, you would find that the Candlewick Inn and all that row of buildings were lined up on a line that is south of the street on the north side of the square. And that all came about accidentally. The way of it was this, that in an early day, the first store or house or whatever it was to be built there was placed in the wrong position. It was placed too far east and too far south. I'm not sure, but what that was, the Old Fort, which was a combination hotel and also, they had an eating house there. The story is that in the circuit riding days, on one occasion that Judge David Davis, who was one of Lincoln's close supporters, and ultimately put on the Supreme Court of the United States by Lincoln, who was our circuit judge at the time, with a very big circuit because there wasn't much population, out of Springfield at one time was eating there and put his feet up on the table. And the Mrs. DeVoe, I think it was, who was running it, was just horrified because she was sure the judge would not have done that in his own home. Well, at any rate, everybody lined up on that first building, which was put in the wrong place. And when the last building along there going east to be built was a brick building that houses the Candlewick Inn, which before that time, for many, many years, was the First National Bank. And the Masons, had their Masonic Hall on the third floor from a very early date. Dr. Noacker owned that lot. He was a power in his day here, and he knew how many front feet he was supposed to have, and there weren't enough feet if he lined up on where the street should have been. So he was a bruiser type, and he built this thing as far east as the number of feet in his lot to which he was supposedly entitled him. And that's the way that this block in which we are now is all out of kilter. As a matter of fact, the front part of our building here really is in the street. And if the city of Monticello wanted to do anything about it, we'd be in a bad shape, because they never lose title to the streets and the alleys of the town, regardless of how long somebody occupies them.
How long did your parents attend school?
Pardon me?
How long did your parents attend school?
Well, my mother had some college education, but only in summertime, because she was a teacher, and she was at the University of Valparaiso. My grandfather had 4 girls, and my father was the last of his children. He was prosperous enough to send, and this is a little bit unusual back in those days, all 4 girls went to college. They went over to Jacksonville, where I think it was Illinois College or McMurray or something like that. When it came my father's time, my grandfather was in poor financial straits, and he couldn't go to school. He taught country school for a while. He had a boon companion, Albert Hazard, and years later, when they were both married, these two families were quite close. There was a Hazard grocery store on the west side of the square, and interestingly enough, Albert Hazard's father, Michael Hazard, produced quintuplets in his family. And this made Monticello famous throughout the United States for a brief moment. And I know in the cemetery north of town, where all 5 of these babies are buried, each one with a headstone. They lived only a few days. But and my father clerked in there with his boon companion, Albert Hazard. Out in front, they had a blackboard. And on the blackboard, somebody had to go out each day and write up the price of eggs or the price of sugar or whatever it was they deemed appropriate. And this job fell to my father because he was a fine penman. Now, this was before the days of typewriters. And the local abstractor in the abstractor business, going by that blackboard and seeing this fine writing and needing something like that for the abstracts, which were produced by hand, in longhand, he hired my father. And that's the way, as a young man, he got in the abstract business. Finally, he bought it out, and I inherited it from him. So we've been in the abstract business for almost a century. Not quite. They have to have a few more years to go, and I'm not sure I can make them, but at any rate, we're trying.
Where was the abstract office located?
I'm not sure at that time, but for years, it was upstairs, opposite the north door of the courthouse, in what at that time was called the Tatman Building. And this was before the day of telephones, too. And so there was a telegrapher's wire run around the square by interested young people mostly of the time, of which my father was one, and they learned the Morse code so that they could talk back and forth by telegraph around the public square of Monticello. And it stayed there until in the neighborhood of 1907, about that, when this building was built. About that time, John Kirby, who was responsible for the hospital, owned the business. In fact, my father ultimately bought it from Mr. Kirby. And he, with Payne Harris, built this building. Payne Harris had the other side, and Mr. Kirby had this side. If you look up, the Kirby name is on this building. But it was about 1907 that the abstract company was moved here to this building.
When did your parents get married?
That would be 1899.
And that's when your father built the house down on
Yes,
Main Street?
before they were married, so they were able to move into it. The honeymoon was in Chicago. Back in those days, they could get to Chicago. I'm sure the Chicago branch must have been, the war base must have been built by that time. At the time my grandfather came out in 1954, the railroad, the Illinois Central, had just reached Champaign. And the question was whether to settle in Champaign, but they wanted to be more pioneering than that, so they came on through to Monticello, but we didn't get a railroad for a long time. B-Mint got theirs, I think, in 1856 or some early date like that.
How many children were in your family when you were growing up?
Just one.
Just one. You were the only child.
And we have only one child, and he's a senior executive, whatever that means, in the Defense Department in Washington. And on the side is a brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve. He's got an interesting job. He's just covered up with work. He's just come back from Europe last Friday night. He'd been there just 6 days attending a conference and didn't know how he could possibly take the time off, but had to go.
Did your mother ever work after she was married?
No, except working to keep me in order.
Homemaker, yes.
Yeah.
Did anyone live with your family besides your parents ever? Your grandparents
No.
ever live with you?
Oh, no.
Where did you go to school?
Well, my father graduated from Monticello High School in the 5th class to graduate. And I believe there were only 5 graduates at the time that he graduated. And the graduation ceremony called for each graduate to read a poem or do something back in those days. Then I came along, I graduated in 1919, and I can't tell you the date, I'm sorry to say, when my son graduated here, but we've had 3 generations graduate from Monticello High School. I'm sure there are other 3-generation families also in the town, but it was somewhat unusual back in the 1940s to have had 3 generations here at this high school. From here I was at the University of Illinois for a couple of years. Then I was at Trinity Hall, Cambridge for a year. I came back to the University of Illinois for a semester, went to Dartmouth for a semester, went to the University of Pennsylvania because I wanted to graduate from the Wharton School. And I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School, in 1924. Then there was a lapse in there before I went to law school. and I was in New York City at the time. I went to Columbia Law School for my first year of law, and then finished the other two at the University of Illinois.
How did you happen to go to Cambridge?
Oh, just wanted to. When I was 19, I got to Europe for the first time. Bob Schunkweiler, it used to be the practice on the railroads when they hauled stock to the stockyards in Chicago to provide that for each car of stock, I think, a man could go along in the caboose in order to see that the stock was well taken care of. And I think the man was required in the early days of railroading. Later on, the railroads themselves assumed the job of caring for the stock. But at least there was a cheap way of going to Chicago. So Bob Schunkweiler and Bob later became a lawyer. He's only died within the year. There's another family, 3 generations of lawyers. Bob's father was a lawyer. Bob was a lawyer, and of course, Judge John Schunkweiler is a lawyer. Well, at any rate, we went to see Davy Martin, who was a cattle buyer here, and he got Bob and me fixed up with transportation to Chicago, to the Chicago stockyards with some cattle that he was shipping. So we got up there free. Then we went to the commission agents who bought Davy's cattle, who had other connections, and they got us aboard a cattle train going to Boston, also free. So we rode cabooses to Boston. We didn't know. We thought we could go to Europe from anywhere on the eastern seaboard, and perhaps we could. But Boston is not a big port. The only place to really do it is to go down to New York. So we paid our way, and we went down to New York, and later on there, Bob finally came home before we got a job on board ship. But I got a job on board ship after he had left, and they went on the good ship Finland to the port of Antwerp. It took us either 7 or 9 days, I can't remember. I was a dishwasher in the first class pantry. There were 3 dishwashers. One was a Brooklyn Wharf rat that had been blown up in someplace in World War I and had his front teeth all missing. Another, Jimmy Kenworthy, was a product of a graduate of a reform school. He took command of the dishwashers by virtue of pugnacity and willingness to fight. But we were a cohesive group. Jimmy was our protector, too. We were a brotherhood. And the thing was that we could have anything we wanted to eat, just as good as the first class passengers had, because there'd always be a lot of food that was left over. But we couldn't have things like salads or bakery goods that required human effort, you see, individually expended. But nevertheless, we got all we wanted, because I can't remember whether Blondie, this fellow had been blown up and had no teeth, was assigned to steal the salads or the pastries. But whatever he was assigned to steal, I was assigned to steal the other thing. And Jimmy took it upon himself to steal anything else that either of the other 2 of us brother dishwashers wanted. And it was not as difficult as you might guess, because at the excitement of a meal, with people rushing here and rushing there, and everyone with a towel over his arm going by the place where there's a pastry or a salad, and hooking it up and putting it under your towel as you went across and secreting it, that wasn't difficult at all. And I've never heard of either one of them since. But
so you did that for 9 days?
What?
You did that for 9 days?
and coming back too.
How long did you spend in Europe then?
Well, we were only in port, I think, about a week, because it took that long to unload the cargo and load the new cargo to go out. And you were supposed to stay around the ship, but without any passengers. There was really nothing for us to do. There were other college boys aboard, and so we all had just one purpose. That was to leave the ship just as soon as it got in port and go off on our own and have a good time and come back on sailing day, because the law was then, and probably still is, you could punish a man all you wanted to, but you could not leave him stranded in a foreign port. So you knew they had to take you on board again to take you home. So I looked around Holland and Belgium and went to London. My first night in London, I slept in Trafalgar Square. Believe it or not, the armies were not fully demobilized after World War I, and there was a bivouac provided or something, tented city, right in the middle of Trafalgar Square, and I slept there one night, the only night I was there in London, for a shilling. And I know I was scared to death that while I slept my shoes would be stolen, but they were not. I was able to go, and I was there so early that attending theater in London, you could attend for practically nothing in the pit. Now, do you know what the pit was? Well, in the early days of theater, the gentry were up a floor all the way around. They looked down. But the common people stood down below. Well, the pit grew into some very shabby and poor seats down in what we call the orchestra today. And it seemed absolutely crazy to me, but it was true. For a pittance, you could go and sit in those very shabby but excellently located seats in London theaters. Of course, that's all a thing of the past, because they sell those seats at high prices today.
Caught on.
Certainly.
So that was when you decided you'd like to go to Cambridge.
That's right.
So you spent a year over there. What did you study?
Oh, they rolled out the red carpet for me. I'll tell you how I got in. I was so green about it. I didn't know how to do it. And you don't apply to Cambridge to get in, or Oxford. You apply to the individual colleges making up Cambridge or Oxford, and there are more colleges there today than there were in my day. But I think we had 17 men's colleges in Cambridge, and about an equivalent number in Oxford. And I was so green I didn't know anything better than to tell them all my good qualities. And my father had an early duplicating machine in which he used talcum powder to dry the duplicated sheet. And this duplicated letter I sent to all the colleges of Cambridge and all of the colleges of Oxford, practically insulting every one of them, that I should think so little of them, that I would, it was hard to get into and all that sort of thing. Well, it just happened that Sir Geoffrey Butler, who had married an American wife and had been the head of the propaganda effort of Britain in Washington at the time of World War I, whether he was amused at that or what happened, I don't know. Because all these, there was Dr. McLean had an office in London where he oversaw American students. And these colleges all began sending Dr. McLean my duplicated petition to get in. And whether Sir Geoffrey was just amused or how it was, he decided he'd see what he could do for me. So he got me into Trinity Hall. And he was quite a prominent man in England. He was the nephew of Rab Butler, who was at one time a candidate for premier, or for prime minister. And Sir Geoffrey's dead now, but his college at Cambridge was Corpus Christi. And there's a library dedicated to Sir Geoffrey at Corpus Christi today, on the far right corner of the main court, which I've never been in. It's always been closed when I've been there, but I've looked in through the windows. Well, that's the way I got there. And having once got there, they examined into what they could do for me. And as I say, they really rolled out the red carpet. And I didn't study as an English boy would. You see, if an English boy went up there for chemistry, it isn't like an American university, but he would study practically nothing but chemistry. And yet the surroundings and the rest of his life and his public school experiences and all that would turn him out a vastly more rounded person, I think, than most of our American graduates, where they make some attempt to introduce them to literature and this, that, and the other thing. But they knew the American system, so I remember I went over to listen to the lectures of Sir Arthur Quillercouch, who is the greatest name in the study of Dickens in that day. His lecture room was so packed so tight that standing there, the other people were wedged so against you, if you lost your footing, I don't think you could have slid to the floor. But he was a great lecturer on the subject of Dickens. And I took a course in international law, and I took a course in history, all these things which an English boy never would have done. And I don't know if you've ever heard of J.B. Priestley or not. Well, he's famous in English literature, and I think he's a playwright and all that sort of thing. He's when we were in London a year ago, or a little bit more, he had a show running then in London, and he's an old man now, approaching 90, of course, but he's always been a character, and he's been a TV character in Britain and all that. But he was living in Cambridge as a young man, and they knew he was a comer, so they sent me over once a week to tutor English literature with J.B. Priestley. So in every way, that was really a great experience.
It sounds like it.
And I happen to have learned, we didn't have back in those days any orchestras or bands in schools. We did have a sort of an orchestra. Miss Renfrew was our music teacher back in those days, but nothing like what they have now. So if you played in the band, you played in the hometown band. And the band that was here in my days was Klein's band. That would be Dempsey Klein, who had his office opposite the north door of the courthouse, was in the insurance business for many years. Well, and our rehearsal hall would be one of the offices up the staircase there opposite the courthouse. A little bit of a cramped room, and believe me, a tremendous racket when everybody got in there playing an instrument. But I learned to play clarinet, as my father had. We've had 3 generations of clarinet players in the hometown band here. My father played clarinet in his day, I played clarinet in my day, our son played clarinet, but that time, however, there was no town band. He played it in the high school band. And, and I learned to play saxophone, which is a kindred instrument. So I was a part of a dance band at Cambridge. Not in the sense that you got paid anything, you didn't. You had dance clubs. Some of the members played, and some of the members danced, and those who played danced when they wanted to. You know, we had a lot of fun. So that summer, we were looking for a job, a professional job, and we were hired to go down to Brighton on the south coast of England, 60 miles out of London. The trains were making it in about an hour back in those days. And there was a nightclub just being opened, Sherry's. So we were hired to go in and play the dance music for the nightclub, and also to give it a good boost. They brought down a troupe of singers and dancers from London for the first 2 or 3 weeks of it, and we played for them. So my wife and I were in London 4 or 5 years ago, I guess. It came a Sunday. There was nothing to do. London's an awfully dead town on Sunday, and I said, let's go down to Brighton, just look the place over again. So we did. We went down to Brighton, and the same good hotel on the Channel was still the best hotel, so we got in a cab at the station and started for the hotel for lunch. And I didn't suppose it was still around, but I said to the cabbie, did you ever hear of a nightclub called Sherry's? Oh, yes, it's going right now, but you wouldn't want to go there. I didn't tell him that I'd helped open the place. And later on, after lunch and all that, we had to go around and take a peek through it was closed, of course, at that time of day, but peek through the windows. It didn't look anything like it did in my day, but
sure
it was there at the same location, still doing business. Mm-hmm. And that summer we went down to Spain, and we were playing guests at a yacht club on the north coast of Spain at Los Serenas. I think it's L-E-S and then A-R-E-N-A-S. At any rate, it's just outside Bilbao. And they were very proud there because both the king and the queen of Spain were members of their yacht club. They could say that one or the other might be members of various clubs, but both the king and the queen were there. The queen was in residence not very far away, but the king had a little lady that had attracted his fancy, and he was spending the summer with her at Deauville, which is a resort in France. The other boys, we had quite a time. The third largest privately owned yacht in the world was tied up in the harbor, and we were aboard her, good friends with Mano Soto, whose father owned it, and we were there with people who represented the titles and the top drawer people of Spain, summering up there on the north coast. The other boys got presented to the queen. I unfortunately had to come home too early. I was able to get a job on ship working my way home. It left at a certain time, and I came home, and even that. And then I got in a little late for school.
And you came back to the University of Illinois then?
Yeah.
And then you went on to
Dartmouth.
And then
the reason for that was Winter Carnival. That seemed like it ought to be a lot of fun at Dartmouth. So.
And then you went to Pennsylvania, you said.
Uh-huh. See, the Wharton School was the first of the colleges of commerce in the country. And it was then, undoubtedly, from as an undergraduate school